All right, welcome. My name is Kyle. I'm going to be giving this talk that I've prepared. I've never talked at HauntCon before. I've gone a few times. Really excited to talk for the first time and talk virtually. I've done a few virtual tours, so I feel like I've gotten a little bit of a hold of it. But I know because I've never talked before, then most people, if anyone's watching this, are like, "Who the heck are you? What is happening right now?" Asking that question about the world in general, but specifically about this talk. I just want to say a little bit about me, what I'm talking about, why I feel like I want to talk about this, and then we're going to get into kind of the meat and potatoes of it all. My name is Kyle. Uh, I currently am a tour guide in New York City, and I've been a tour guide for like 6 years now, but 6 years now. But really, where I kind of came from before this, and part of the reason why I got into being a tour guide was my work and experience in haunted houses. So I started off working as an actor in a haunt in Minneapolis that was called the Haunted Basement. And I ended up building rooms there and kind of like managing some actors and training people. And I did a very weird thing. I just kind of like decided one day to move for no reason whatsoever. And I moved down to New Orleans, and I was an actor in a haunted house down there called the Mortuary. And then also some friends, haunts, one called Bernie Baxter. All of these experiences then kind of, I suddenly decided, you know what I should do is be a tour guide and give ghost tours. So I've been giving a lot of ghost tours, and I've worked in haunted houses, but it really, like, I haven't been able to do the haunted house stuff as much since the ghost tour stuff took over. The thing that I'm going to be talking about particularly today, and what I feel like I'm kind of passionate about, and I really wish whenever I go through a haunt, I'm like, I wish they did this less and this more, is I wanted to talk about this particular topic that I'm going to call how local history and legends will enhance your haunt. And I feel kind of strongly about this as a tour guide because I see so many missed opportunities when I'm, go through a haunted house like in New Orleans or in New York, and they're just like have creepy clowns, and it's like you're missing so much. There's so many weird things that were happening here that like you could be doing that. You could dig down and people would recognize that. And one of the stories that got me thinking about this a lot was I took a tour, a ghost tour. I like to take tours as well as give them. And I took this ghost tour in Tokyo, in Japan. They told me this story. They said the story to the group about a ghost turtle. And I'm telling you this story because I actually didn't like this story at all. In fact, I found it really kind of bizarre that they would talk about it. But I'm going to say why that's important in a second. But they told this story of this turtle that kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it got so big it couldn't really move, and it died. And then sediment started forming around it, and it created this big hill. And they said the legend is that this is the ghost of the giant, massive turtle that turned into a hill. And I heard that story, and I was like, I would never tell a ghost turtle story ever on any tour. But I loved it too because it was so reflective of that was the culture. That was really this kind of well-known story of the ghost turtle that people would talk about. And it didn't hit with me, but it would necessarily maybe hit with people who live there. And that kind of reflecting the culture got me to think more about this as well. You know, I was giving tours down in New Orleans, and my style and my kind of topics changed a lot when I moved to New York, not just because of the history, but because of the kind of like the cultural values that you're reflecting. If you are of the type that really likes science and social science, I actually did some deep dives a while back, and I found a couple studies which kind of support this idea that the local culture kind of reflects and kind of resonates with people. For example, this one study which I show, just kind of the quick title, which basically says that people look through textbooks, Japanese textbooks and American textbooks, and they saw like different values reflected, and that people were kind of drawn to those different values. There's another study that I show right here, which shows that people who tell good stories, which usually are stories that resonate with people, they actually get more benefits. And so the kind of overall like point that I'm trying to make when I talk about all of this stuff is that this will benefit you and your haunt to have more local things that reflect and kind of hit at the people that are going to these haunts. People will be more likely to be scared, and they'll be more likely to come back, and it's just more fun, and you get to be a little bit more creative than just kind of leaning on these tropes, which everyone seems to lean on right there. So that's kind of my basic thesis. And I hope that I've like persuaded you a little bit with this basic thesis, which is that we should be trying to reflect these stories within our haunts. And so then the natural next question is, how do you do that? And I think I'm going to kind of divide this into 3 different sections, because I think there is the finding stories. Like, how do you find these stories first to start with? Like, what methods, besides like Google and Wikipedia, which I'm just going to assume everyone can do, like, how do you find these stories? Then I'm going to talk about how do you create the narrative for these stories? Like, how do you take just like some story you read that's local and then try and create a narrative or a visual narrative, especially for the haunts, around that? And then lastly, what I'm going to try and talk about is just avoiding pitfalls, because there are pitfalls when you try to take this approach that I've learned and that other places have learned as well. So kind of the first part that I want to talk about is just the general idea of like, how do you find these stories? Like, where are they? How do you find them? And I'm going to assume, like I said before, that every single person that's watching this actually knows how to use Google and use Wikipedia. And if you do not know how to do that, then you should probably just pause this video and well, you can't Google it, but you should ask someone how to Google. But that's usually the first thing they do, obviously, that all of us do whenever we hit this. And so that's really not what I want to spend time on, because we all know how to do Google and Wikipedia. But the things that I do want to spend time on is, first of all, one thing that you can do that's really helpful is asking people. And I think this is kind of cool, because you have a lot of actors and a lot of people in touch, and it's really great. It would make them feel involved as well. Blast out an email, call people. In these COVID times, you can't really meet, or do Zoom things, and just like ask, like, what stories did you grow up with? Like, what stories did you hear growing up? And think about it in that way, instead of just going like, oh, well, we must do like a zombie, or this is a new take on a zombie. Say like, okay, what stories did you hear growing up? Not even like scary stories. Like, what stories in general did you hear, the people that are living here, locals here, about that? I do that a lot on my tours, is I ask people and I say like, what do you know about the stories, right? I was not born and raised in New Orleans or New York, so I don't have that background, but other people do. And so you can really take advantage of that. Now, one example of where this can benefit you, so like I want to give an example that was really helpful for me. In that haunted house in the haunted basement, I once made a room. And the idea behind this room, I was trying to do like this kids' craft room gone awry. The narrative I had in my brain in building this room was that there were a bunch of like children who were kind of like trapped in this craft room, and for some reason they didn't die, and they kept on living, and they like created their own little weird culture all based around the crafts of the room. And so it's like adults but like still dressed as kids, and like drawings on their face, and I had a big blanket fort that people could kind of crawl through and that sort of thing. And they had staple guns, of course, because staple guns, with no staples in them, they could like try and use on people. But one thing that I kind of came up on was, I was like, okay, there's this giant display case. Like, I found this giant display case, and it was right in the entryway. And it's like, but what would go in the giant display case? And I talked to a friend of mine, whose name is Teresa, and her mom was a teacher, and she had all of these old posters that were used in her own classroom, and she saved them, but also just didn't care about them. And so Teresa was able to get me all of these posters, and I put them up, and I'll kind of show you, first one, like I have kind of, I'm not sure how I'm going to do this, but I'm going to edit in later, this picture of me right there. And you can kind of see in the corner over there that there's actually a poster, which, it says, be helpful. And that's an actual poster from an actual classroom that, we kind of tore to the side right there, right? Another one that I have is just, it's great being me. And I had like a lot of the other actors and people like literally draw, those drawings were just people that I just said, like, draw whatever you want on the wall right there, right? Just go crazy. So What's funny then is I heard people and I knew of people that when they went through, they were like, oh my God, my classroom had these posters, right? They it really reflected with them. They're like, oh man, like I remember that poster from when I was a kid right there. And that just, that hits them on another angle. Not necessarily, but I do think a little bit like a fear angle because it feels a little bit more real, but also just kind of like it clicks in their brain and then they can say like, and then they had like posters that from when I was a kid right there, right? It just adds another level of connection that I don't imagine many people going through. They're like, that's like the zombie from my childhood. So like things like that, I think can kind of like touch on people and just think about the resources that other people have, the stories that other people have as well. So that's one thing you can do. Just talk to people, right? It creates more of a bond. People feel like they're more involved. It's great. The other thing that you can do, which might sound counterintuitive to my general thesis, which is that you can, use local stories, and I can say like, don't be bounded and really strict on local stories. What I mean by that is like, let's say you live in a town, like it's kind of cool to like look one town over, two towns over. I wouldn't go to the other side of the country, but just kind of like expand your reach a little bit. And the example for this, I was given like a commission last Halloween to do a ghost tour, a virtual ghost tour for the city of Baltimore. And I've never lived in Baltimore. I've been there a few times. I've actually taken a ghost tour there before, but I've never lived there before. And I had some friends living there, and they wanted to do this kind of like cool thing with a bunch of their friends. And they commissioned me to do a Baltimore ghost tour. So I spent a lot of time researching it, and I felt like I had a pretty good sense on it. You got your like Edgar Allan Poe, you got like some like kind of creepy grave robbing stuff, but I was like, there's something kind of missing here. So I looked a little bit outside. I said, what else is happening in rural Maryland? And there's a lot of German immigrants there, and they had this idea of a mythical beast called a snallygaster. And I guess this has maybe been used in Harry Potter since then, but this actually goes back a long way. And so I started digging down that, and I said like, oh, okay, there's like newspaper articles and they're like images of what people thought the snallygaster looked like, and what's this, and oh, they have another creature which they battle. And I'm talking about this as like a particularly like visual thing, right? You have this like visual creature which you can incorporate, and I'm doing stories about it, but this is a visual thing as well. So this is another way that you can do this. Just like take where you're at, look there, and if you're still not really feeling it, you can just go, just like take it out just a little bit. And I guarantee there will be something somewhere. Someone will say something, or you'll kind of stumble across some article of something weird that goes back a really long time right there. So that would be another thing that I would recommend people do as well. Uh, Another example, by the way, is not in New Orleans, but like Cajun culture surrounding New Orleans, like has this concept of something called a rougarou, which is this kind of mythical beast creature that was like a werewolf, right? And people would always tell stories about the rougarou while they're doing ghost tours in New Orleans, which actually doesn't have anything to do with New Orleans, but still kind of feels like that general area, right? When we say like these towns and cities, these are kind of porous borders right there. Uh, and the last thing on the why, on the how do you like find the stories to start with? So first thing, obviously, like the Google, Wikipedia, do that stuff. Talk to people. You can find things that are like adjacent. And really what you just got to do, and what I kind of gotten in the habit of, is you just consume things all the time. Just have it be like an ongoing thing in your background. And I know that that might be difficult because we all have lives and things that we're not necessarily thinking like, oh, I just got to like make this a full-time job. You don't. But just kind of have it like, like, oh, it's kind of interesting to learn more about the area that you're surrounding. For the example of this, I went on, I did not give, but I went on a virtual tour of what was called the Five Points. They made that movie Gangs of New York about it. It's called the Five Points. And today it would be like around Chinatown. And I went on this virtual tour someone was giving, and I was like, I could probably brush up on that. I don't know a ton about that. Like, it'll give me some ideas. And I went on this virtual tour, and it was pretty good. But the one thing this guy just mentioned as a throwaway line, he just said, like, well, you know, and a lot of people would go and watch at the bars, they'd go to the rat pits. But anyway, and then he started talking about something else. And in my brain, I was like, wait a minute, like, you can't just skip over the rat pit line. You're going to need to, like, dig into that a little bit more. So I did my own research. I started finding that, and this was an actual thing at a lot of bars, not just in New York, but all over, that people would literally, for entertainment, go down to the basement and they'd watch like a dog kill a bunch of rats. And that was like, it wasn't just dog fighting, it was like dogs just killing rats. And they would bet on how many rats that the dog could kill within a set period of time. And so I was like, well, that's weird. And then it starts you down all these other questions. You start saying like, okay, so like rat pits existed and people would watch that, but who are the people collecting all of these rats? Like, what is happening there? Like, they have to collect live rats for this? And then you start saying like, well, okay, like what are these people watching it? What did they look like? What was the scene? What was happening here? And all of this then starts to like create new wormholes for you to go down. And it really, like, I would have never probably, if I was laser focused on these different topics, I wouldn't have like come across the rat pits necessarily. It's only when you kind of have this like widespread, just kind of like looking for something and it just kind of hits you and you're like, that's a weird concept. So I would just say like that's another thing that you just, if you could just kind of train yourself. I know it's a little bit hard. I know our attention's all over the place nowadays, but that would be really helpful as well. Now, that's kind of like the how to find stories. I do want to talk about like how do you make narratives, and the first thing that you really just got to do, and this is maybe something you train yourself over time, but you got to just find the hook. What's the thing about it that like kind of scares you? Talking about the rat pits, right? So I'm giving a ghost tour, and rats and rat pits are not necessarily ghosts. You know, they're creepy, and you can do a lot of imagery of like someone like collecting the rats and they're coming out of the bag and they're like crawling up on people. But in and of itself is not particularly like connected to ghosts until you start thinking, well, what happens to the rats after they die, right? Are there such a thing as rat ghosts? There's apparently such a thing as turtle ghosts, so why can't there be such a thing as rat ghosts? So you think about like what a rat ghost would do. What would that look like, right? This is all kind of narrative creative. You find a thing like weird rat pits. You say, okay, well, what? You start thinking about all of the things around it. Like, what does a rat pit do? It kills rats, so they're a rat ghost. What would a rat ghost do? And the first thing I would say to people on the tours is I'd say, like, well, imagine you're sitting at the bar and you feel something scurry across, right? Scurry across your leg, and then you look down and there's nothing there, right? And even more so, you start saying, like, well, what about all these bars? What's their history, right? And you start looking at down these rabbit holes and finding, oh, this particular bar just over there closed down just a few years ago because there were rat problems. So these narratives start to build themselves, but the way you kind of like find these hooks is you just kind of like think of all angles of something. And I know that that's kind of specific to giving tours, and you're still thinking about haunts and visuals, but the rat room, it just writes itself right there, right? Now, the other way that you can do this is not just like finding like a particular idea, but you can find a place and try and recreate it. In New York, for example, there is an abandoned train station which you can visit, and it's the City Hall station. It's one of the first train stations, and you can actually take the 6 train, and if you keep on taking it past the end of the line, it actually turns around and goes right past it. And I'll kind of show you. You can actually see what I'm showing you right now, which I'm going to edit in later. But you can kind of see what that looks like right there. So that's another thing is I said, okay, this is a cool place. What story can I build around that? What ghosts can I talk about? What's a the subway ghost, the subway station ghost? How did they build these? And that's just another way that you can think of like visually. You can say like, okay, like a train station, yes, naturally, and bring that in as well. So ways that you can make narratives. Think about all the ideas around it and what is the hook, and just keep following that. Also, like, what is the place? What does that place look like? And kind of build that like atmosphere around the place. One thing that may be happening is that I know that you're saying like, well, Kyle, you are talking about someone who is living either in New Orleans or New York, and there's just like hundreds of years of history. They're big cities, you can go down a lot of rabbit holes. And I wanted to kind of prove that this isn't really something that is just, for these places that just have like hundreds of years of history. Pretty much anywhere has the ability to do what I'm talking about. To do this, I wanted to employ and just try it out on my own. So what I did is I went to like Google Maps, right? And like there's like big old map of the United States. And I just took the cursor and just kind of like swirled it around a bunch and just closed my eyes and just, said where it was. And wherever it landed, I wanted to try and create some sort of cool narrative, some kind of cool story about that place in particular. And my rule to myself was, I'm like, you can't redo this unless you like end up in New York or something like that. You cannot redo this no matter where you are. You find like the nearest town and you have to do this about that town. So I did this, and I'll kind of bring it up and I'll show you. I ended up in this place called Litchfield, Illinois, and you can see it's actually pretty close. It's less than an hour drive from St. Louis, and Litchfield turned out to be perfect. And at first I was like, how cool that I just ended up somewhere perfect. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, all places are like this, right? So first thing I did is I did some, the Google Wikipedia track, as we all do, and I found out that Litchfield has this long history of being involved with the railroad and being involved with Route 66, and it was kind of a supply stop for a lot of people. So I'm like, right off the bat there, railroads are creepy. I don't know, like those old steam engine trains. I mean, I can just see so many different angles from just going like railroads, just right there. And so many towns have that as part of their history too. So like that's one thing, like creepy train conductors, weird train people, like someone hit by a train comes back to life. Things like that are just perfect right there. So then the next step is I said, like, okay, and most towns have this, is they all pretty much have some sort of historical society. It may be small, it may be like just like an old lady who's just operating the whole thing, but everybody has it. Field trip, or look online these days, look everything you can related to that. Now, luckily, Litchfield has an especially cool one, and you look, and just in and of itself, it's got these crazy neon lights, this welcome center museum that has a museum. So like go visit the museum right there. There's a historical society online. I started just looking through photos they had online of Litchfield. And you see this cool building, you see another cool building. These are creepy. That looks like something from the movie Psycho, right? Or, something like that. Uh, when you look in even further, you can see this old supply store, which is perfect. This long hallway, like I can just imagine people walking through that, with weird supplies, things falling, jumping out, grabbing people through that. You can also see this industrial space that I found as well right there. Another perfect example. So these are great things that you can easily form narratives around if you just look at the historical society. And all of this literally took me like 5 to 10 minutes to find this. And already, like, I can imagine this just being a lot richer than just going for the standard tropes. The other reason why Litchfield was perfect was because it turns out that there was actually an event there which is the perfect example of how to avoid pitfalls, which is the third and final point of this talk I'm doing. How do you avoid pitfalls is you do not do the thing that I'm about to tell you. Because you may be tempted to go, what awful historical events have happened here? And take inspiration from that. So in Litchfield, and I'll show you, I found this book. People wrote books about this. There was an awful event that happened in the early 90s. It says here, in central Illinois in Litchfield, the nude, headless body of a woman is discovered in a pile of burning brush. And so, heavy. And that's in the early 90s, right? Now, based off of everything I've been saying, there may be this temptation where people will say like, oh, well, what we should do is find the most grisly, awful murder and take all sorts of examples from that and try and include that. That is not what I'm saying. Not at all, right? Because what will happen, this is in the early 90s, there will be probably someone going through, if you reference this, who knows someone affected by that, and that will be triggering to them, and that will cause all sorts of backlash to your haunt right there. You want to make sure that you take kind of two things into account whenever I think about historical events and tours: the recentness and the awfulness. And if it's too recent or too awful, just go the other way. In New Orleans, there's actually an example of people who kind of built this tour in through a haunted house. So it was kind of like a hybrid tour haunted house mix. And it was based off of the events of two people who were involved in a murder-suicide named Zach and Addie. And this happened right after Hurricane Katrina. This happened in 2006. And you can see there was actually, I'll bring up this kind of headline. People say, like, they bring people in and they talk about, they actually like went to the place where this happened. And I knew people giving tours and they'd tell the story, and I still felt like, probably shouldn't do that. Because there are people walking around and they hear that and they know those people, and it doesn't feel good to be reminded of that. We don't enter into haunted houses to be reminded of reality. So you want to make sure that you're not like including things that will trigger people in that way, and you're just going to have like so many problems if you decide to do that. And you may say this like, oh, well, all publicity is good publicity, and it doesn't work like that when everybody hates you in your local community and decides not to go to your haunt. That's not good publicity right there. I hope that this was helpful, just kind of like backtracking, thinking more about this. It is really, I feel really passionately that I would love to see in people's haunts, people just kind of referencing things around them a little bit more and stop just kind of going for these easy, just low-hanging fruits of zombies or vampires or whatever right there, right? Unless there's a prominent zombie vampire local legend that you can draw from. Otherwise, I'd just say that the best ways to do that, really just, again, you want to look, talk to people, ask people what local legends, see what's around your area, just consume all you can. Try and find these hooks. What is it about this that you find scary? What's the scariest way to present this particular item? Then you want to kind of find a location, think about it around there, and I hope that that's all just going to help and helpful. You just also want to avoid making it too personal and affecting people too much. But yeah, if you've stayed with me so far, then I hope that you've found this enjoyable. My name is Kyle, and I do have my own company here. It's called Atypical Tours. And yeah, feel free to let me know if you have any questions. I don't know the exact system for how they ask questions, but feel free to use that system, and I'll try and answer them the best that I can, and I hope that you found this helpful.